What if the next flash of light over the Persian Gulf is not a conventional bomb, but something far more terrifying? What if President Trump, in a moment of crisis or calculation, gives the order that no American leader has given in over 80 years? The world today is watching the Middle East teeter on the edge of a wider war. American and Israeli forces have already struck deep into Iran, hitting nuclear facilities and eliminating key commanders. The conflict is no longer a shadow war fought in the dark. It is a direct, open confrontation with the Islamic Republic. And yet, even as the bombs fall and the missiles fly, there remains one line that has not been crossed. A line drawn in the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A line that every president since Truman has respected, knowing that to cross it would change everything. But what if that line is finally erased? What if Donald Trump, facing what he sees as an existential threat or an historic opportunity, decides to use a nuclear weapon against Iran? This video is not about the morality of such an act. It is not about the politics of any single administration. It is a cold, detailed exploration of a scenario that military planners and intelligence agencies around the world are quietly gaming out. We are going to walk through the reasons such an order might be given, the targets that would be chosen, and the cascade of consequences that would follow for Iran, for the United States, and for every corner of the globe. We will look at whether a nuclear strike would actually end Iran as a threat or whether it would ignite something far more dangerous. And we will confront the question that has haunted the nuclear age since its very beginning. Would the use of a nuclear weapon in the Middle East be the spark that finally sets off World War III? By the end of this video, you will understand not just the mechanics of such a strike, but the terrifying chain reaction that would follow, one that could reshape the world order for generations. Before we continue, please support the channel by liking the video, hitting the hype button, and subscribing to help us grow. We greatly appreciate your support. Why would Trump nuke Iran? To understand why an American president would even consider unleashing a nuclear weapon, we have to go back to the central promise that has defined Donald Trump's approach to Iran since his first days in office. He has said repeatedly, in speeches, in interviews, and in private conversations with advisors, that Iran must never possess a nuclear weapon. This is not a position rooted in nuance or negotiation. It is a red line, absolute and unconditional. For years, that red line was enforced through sanctions, through diplomacy, and eventually through the threat of military force. But now, after months of escalating conflict, the situation has changed. American warplanes have already struck Iranian nuclear sites. The facilities at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan have been hit. According to intelligence assessments, Iran's ability to enrich uranium to weapons grade has been severely degraded. In fact, some reports suggest that Iran is not currently trying to rebuild its enrichment program at all. The program that was the justification for the war has been, in the words of one official, obliterated. And yet, the war continues. The bombing has not stopped. The rhetoric from Washington has only grown more intense. So the question that emerges is a deeply uncomfortable one. If Iran no longer has a functional nuclear program to stop, what exactly is the war trying to achieve? Is it about a future threat that might one day emerge, or is it about something else entirely, something that conventional bombs cannot touch? This is where the most immediate and dangerous dilemma comes into focus. Even if the centrifuges are destroyed, even if the scientists are scattered, there remains a vast amount of nuclear material hidden beneath the rubble of the facilities that were struck. Intelligence estimates put the figure at roughly 970 pounds of uranium, enriched to levels just below weapons grade. This material is not sitting in a neat, easily accessible stockpile. It is buried under collapsed buildings, under reinforced concrete, under mountains of debris from the earlier airstrikes. In some cases, it is deep inside facilities like Fordow, which was built into a mountain specifically to withstand attack. The United States now faces a choice that military planners have been dreading for years. Option 1 is to send in ground troops, thousands of American soldiers, to secure these sites, to dig through the rubble, to find and remove the uranium before it can be recovered by Iranian forces or smuggled out of the country. This would be a mission of extraordinary danger. Iran is a vast, mountainous country with a population nearly 3 times that of Iraq. The regime still controls significant military forces, and the population, whatever their feelings about their government, have shown little appetite for an American occupation. A ground operation to secure the nuclear sites would almost certainly turn into a protracted, bloody conflict that would cost American lives and treasure for years to come. Option 2 is to destroy the material from the air, to use the most powerful conventional bombs in the American arsenal to collapse the tunnels, to bury the uranium even deeper, to render it inaccessible. But conventional bombs have limits. The bunker busters that can penetrate reinforced concrete have a finite capability. When a facility is already buried under its own rubble, when the uranium is scattered across multiple collapsed levels, a conventional bomb might simply disperse the material, making it even harder to recover, but also easier for a determined adversary to collect later. There is only one weapon in the American inventory that guarantees the complete destruction of that uranium, that vaporizes it so thoroughly that no trace remains, that does not require a single American soldier to set foot on Iranian soil. That weapon is the B-6111, a nuclear gravity bomb designed specifically to burrow deep underground and detonate, turning everything in its radius into superheated plasma. In the minds of some strategists, this is not an act of madness. It is a calculated solution to an impossible problem. Use a single nuclear weapon to destroy the uranium, end the threat, and avoid the quagmire of a ground war. It is a seductive argument, and it is one that has been discussed in the corridors of power for years. But there is another, even more ambitious reason why a president might reach for the nuclear option. The language coming out of Washington has shifted. What began as a campaign to degrade Iran's military capabilities has evolved into something far more sweeping. Officials have started using the phrase unconditional surrender, a term that has not been applied to an American adversary since World War II. If the goal is no longer simply to stop Iran from getting a bomb, but to force the complete collapse of the Islamic Republic, then a nuclear weapon takes on a new role. It becomes the ultimate shock weapon, the one act that shatters the regime's will to resist. In this view, a nuclear strike on the Supreme Leader's bunker, on the command and control centers buried deep under Tehran, on the Revolutionary Guard headquarters, would decapitate the Iranian government in a single moment. The regime would be gone. The military would be leaderless. The nation would have no choice but to surrender. This is the logic of regime change by atomic bomb, a logic that has been debated in military circles since the end of the Cold War. It is a logic that promises a clean, decisive end to a messy, intractable conflict. But as we will see throughout this video, the promise of decisiveness often comes with consequences that no amount of planning can anticipate. What does Trump gain? From the perspective of the White House, a nuclear strike would offer a set of advantages that conventional warfare simply cannot provide. The first and most obvious is the promise of decisiveness. The United States has spent the better part of 2 decades fighting wars in the Middle East that have no clear end. The war in Afghanistan lasted 20 years and ended with a chaotic withdrawal. The war in Iraq lasted nearly 9 years, cost trillions of dollars, and left behind a fragile, unstable state. The war against ISIS dragged on for years, requiring a massive international coalition. In every case, the American public grew weary of the conflict, and the political costs for the presidents who led them were immense. A nuclear strike would be the opposite of a long, drawn-out war. It would be a single, overwhelming act that leaves no room for negotiation, no gradual escalation, no protracted counterinsurgency. In the space of a few minutes, the target would be destroyed, the mission would be accomplished, and the war, at least in the minds of its advocates, would be over. For a president who campaigned on ending endless wars and bringing troops home, the ability to solve the Iranian problem with one strike is an extraordinarily attractive proposition. There is a second advantage that extends far beyond the borders of Iran. A nuclear strike would serve as the ultimate demonstration of American resolve. For decades, adversaries like North Korea, Russia, and China have watched the United States fight long, inconclusive wars. They have seen American presidents hesitate to use force, withdraw from conflicts, and fail to follow through on threats. They have come to believe that the United States lacks the will to do what is necessary to protect its interests. A nuclear strike would shatter that perception overnight. It would send a message to Pyongyang that no amount of mountain fortifications can protect them from the full weight of American power. It would tell Beijing that the United States is willing to use its most destructive weapons if its interests are threatened. It would remind Moscow that for all its nuclear posturing, the American arsenal remains the most formidable on Earth. This is deterrence through demonstration, the idea that the only way to convince your enemies that you are willing to use your most powerful weapons is to actually use them, at least once. It is a dangerous logic, but it is one that has been advocated by strategists who believe that the nuclear taboo has made the world more dangerous by encouraging aggression. The third perceived gain is perhaps the most politically potent of all. A nuclear strike would accomplish its mission without putting a single American service member at risk. The prospect of a ground war in Iran is a nightmare scenario for any administration. Iran is not Iraq. It is a nation of nearly 90 million people with a sophisticated military, a mountainous terrain that favors the defender, and a population that, while often critical of its government, has shown fierce resistance to foreign intervention, securing the scattered nuclear sites, digging out the buried uranium, neutralizing the remaining military forces. All of this would require a large-scale ground operation. Estimates from military analysts suggest that tens of thousands of troops would be needed, and even then, the operation would take months, perhaps years, and would almost certainly result in significant American casualties. A nuclear strike bypasses all of that. The weapon is delivered by an aircraft flying at high altitude, far beyond the range of Iranian air defenses. No soldiers have to storm the beaches. No convoys have to navigate ambushes. No medevac helicopters have to evacuate the wounded. In a political environment where any American casualty is a headline and any loss of life is a political crisis, the promise of zero American deaths is almost impossible to resist. But there is a fourth gain, one that is rarely spoken about openly but is understood in the corridors of power. A nuclear strike would be a political statement of the most profound kind. It would demonstrate that the president who ordered it was willing to make decisions that no one else would dare to make. It would establish a legacy of decisiveness, of strength, of a willingness to do whatever it takes to protect the nation. For a leader who has built his political identity around the idea of being a disruptor, of breaking the rules that have held back previous presidents, the nuclear option represents the ultimate disruption. It is the one thing that no one expects, the one line that everyone assumes will never be crossed. Crossing it would redefine the presidency for better or worse, and would ensure that the name of the president who gave the order would be remembered for generations. Whether that memory would be one of admiration or infamy is a question that would only be answered in the years that followed. Where and what targets? If the order were ever given, the targets would not be chosen randomly. They would be selected with a precision that the word nuclear makes almost impossible to imagine, but military planners have spent decades identifying exactly which locations would be hit. The primary targets would be the deep-buried nuclear facilities that conventional weapons cannot destroy. At the top of this list is Isfahan, a city of ancient beauty that has also served as the heart of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Beneath the surface, buried under layers of reinforced concrete and the rubble of earlier strikes, lies the bulk of Iran's near-weapons-grade uranium. Intelligence agencies believe that as much as 970 pounds of material, enough for multiple nuclear devices, is scattered across the facility's underground levels. A conventional bunker buster, no matter how powerful, cannot guarantee the destruction of that material. It might simply spread it further, creating a radioactive debris field that could be harvested later. A nuclear bunker buster, on the other hand, would vaporize the uranium, turning it into a plasma that would cool into harmless, widely dispersed particles. In the minds of those who advocate for the strike, this is not just a military necessity. It is a safety measure, ensuring that the material can never be recovered. Alongside Isfahan, The facilities at Fordow and Natanz would also be high on the target list. Fordow is a special case. It was built inside a mountain, a fact that Iran has long boasted makes it impervious to attack. The facility is carved into the rock near the city of Qom, protected by dozens of meters of natural stone and reinforced concrete. For years, military analysts considered Fordow the ultimate challenge for American conventional weapons. It was designed to survive anything short of a nuclear strike. And that is precisely why a nuclear strike would be considered. The B-6111 is capable of penetrating deep into the mountain before detonating, creating an underground cavity that would collapse the tunnels and destroy everything inside. Natanz, while less fortified than Fordow, remains a sprawling complex with extensive underground facilities. A nuclear strike on Natanz would be aimed not just at the centrifuges that have already been destroyed, but at the command and control infrastructure, the research laboratories, and the hidden stockpiles of material that might have been moved underground in the weeks before the war. But the targets might not be limited to nuclear facilities. There is another location that has been mentioned publicly by President Trump himself, and that is Karg Island. During the conventional phase of the conflict, the president boasted about obliterating the island, which serves as Iran's primary oil export terminal. He stated at the time that he had avoided striking the oil infrastructure out of what he called decency. But he also warned that this restraint would not last forever if Iran continued to threaten the Strait of Hormuz. Karg Island is not just an oil terminal. It is also home to some of the most hardened command and control facilities in Iran. Beneath the island's surface, buried deep in the rock, are bunkers used by the supreme leader, the senior military command, and the intelligence services. A nuclear strike on Karg Island would serve two purposes simultaneously. It would decapitate the regime by destroying its leadership in their deepest shelters, and it would cripple Iran's economy by eliminating its ability to export oil. For a president looking for a decisive end to the conflict, the symbolism of destroying both the regime's leadership and its economic lifeline in a single blow would be immense. There is a final category of targets that would be considered if the conflict escalated even further. The Strait of Hormuz itself, the narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil flows, is a potential target. Iran has threatened to close the strait in response to a major American attack. If that threat were carried out, if Iranian mines and missiles began sinking tankers and blocking the channel, the United States would face a choice. It could try to clear the mines conventionally, a slow and dangerous process, or it could use nuclear weapons to destroy the Iranian naval bases, the missile batteries, and the mine storage facilities that line the strait. A nuclear strike on the Iranian side of the strait would send a message that the United States would not tolerate any disruption to global oil supplies. It would also contaminate the waters of the Persian Gulf for years, poisoning fisheries and desalination plants that provide fresh water to millions of people across the region. The choice of targets, in other words, is not just a military calculation. It is a decision about the kind of war the United States wants to fight and the kind of world it wants to leave behind. The immediate aftermath in Iran. To understand what would happen if a nuclear weapon struck Iran, we have to move beyond the strategic calculations and look at the human and physical reality on the ground. Iran is a nation of nearly 90 million people, with a history that stretches back over 2,500 years. A nuclear strike, even a relatively low-yield tactical weapon, would unleash destruction on a scale that has not been seen since the end of World War II. If the target were a major city like Isfahan, the casualties would be counted in the hundreds of thousands within the first few seconds. Those closest to the epicenter would be vaporized instantly, their bodies turned to ash before their nerves could even register pain. The blast wave would travel outward at hundreds of miles per hour, leveling buildings, shattering windows for miles, and turning cars, lampposts, and anything else in its path into deadly projectiles. And then would come the heat, a fireball that would ignite everything flammable for miles in every direction, creating a firestorm that would consume the city long after the initial blast had passed. The temperature at the center of the fireball would reach millions of degrees, hot enough to melt steel, to turn concrete to dust, to fuse sand into glass. For those who survived the initial explosion, a new horror would begin. Radiation sickness would set in within hours, bringing with it nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and a slow, agonizing decline as the body's cells are destroyed from within. The medical facilities in the affected region, if they survived, would be overwhelmed beyond capacity. There would be no way to treat the hundreds of thousands of burn victims, the radiation poisoned, the wounded. The concept of a functioning society would cease to exist in the blast zone. Government, law enforcement, water supply, electricity, all of it would be gone. Those who could would flee, clogging the roads in a desperate attempt to escape the invisible poison spreading from the blast site. But radiation does not respect borders. Fallout carried by the wind would drift across neighboring countries, contaminating farmland, poisoning water supplies, and causing long-term health effects for populations far from the original target. The dust and debris thrown into the atmosphere would circle the globe, detectable in the upper atmosphere for years. Beyond the human catastrophe, the strike would physically erase some of the most important sites in Iranian history and culture. Isfahan is not just a city. It is a living museum of Persian civilization. Its magnificent Islamic architecture, its bridges that have stood for centuries, its palaces, its bazaars, its role as a center of art and learning for over 1,000 years, all of it would be transformed into a radioactive wasteland. The loss would not be Iran's alone. It would be a loss for all of humanity, akin to the destruction of the Library of Alexandria or the burning of the Louvre. The environmental devastation would be equally staggering. Radioactive particles would settle in the soil, making agriculture impossible for generations. The Zagros Mountains, which have stood since before human history began, would be contaminated. The Persian Gulf, one of the most ecologically sensitive bodies of water on Earth, would receive a massive influx of radioactive material, poisoning fisheries and desalination plants that provide fresh water to millions. In the space of a single morning, a nation with a rich and ancient heritage would be permanently scarred, its land poisoned, its people decimated, and its future stolen. And yet, even in the face of such devastation, the nation would not cease to exist. The survivors would find a way to go on. They would bury their dead, if they could. They would try to rebuild, if they could. They would carry with them the memory of what was lost, and the anger at those who took it from them. A nuclear strike would not end Iran. It would create a new Iran, one forged in trauma, one that would never forget. The regime that ordered the strike might see this as a victory, the destruction of an enemy government. But governments are not nations. Nations are made of people, and people who survive such a catastrophe do not forget. They do not forgive. They wait, and they plan, and they pass their grief and their fury down to their children. This is the human reality that no strategic calculation can ever fully account for. Consequences for America. While the world focused on the mushroom cloud over Iran, the consequences for the United States would begin to unfold with terrifying speed. The first and most immediate consequence would be the collapse of America's moral standing in the world. Since 1945, the United States has positioned itself as the guardian of the nuclear taboo. American presidents have publicly affirmed that nuclear weapons should never be used again. The United States has signed treaties, pushed for non-proliferation, and condemned other nations for even testing nuclear devices. All of that would be shattered the moment a nuclear weapon left an American bomber. European allies, many of whom were not even consulted about the conventional strikes on Iran, would be horrified. Protests would erupt in London, Paris, Berlin, and Rome. Governments would face impossible choices, whether to stand by an ally that had committed an act widely considered a crime against humanity, or to distance themselves and face the consequences of breaking with Washington. The United Nations would descend into chaos, with emergency sessions that would likely end in condemnation resolutions that even America's closest allies could not vote against. The phrase war criminal would be used openly, not by America's enemies, but by its friends. But the diplomatic isolation, while devastating, would not be the most immediate threat to American interests. That threat would come from a narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz. This 30-mile-wide channel between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula is the single most important choke point for global oil supplies in the world. Approximately 20% of all the oil consumed on planet Earth passes through this strait every single day. Iran has spent decades preparing for the possibility of a conflict with the United States, and at the heart of its military strategy is what military planners call the killer box. The idea is simple. In the event of an existential threat, Iran would use its arsenal of mines, small boats, anti-ship missiles, and submarines to shut down the strait. It would not matter if the American Navy was the most powerful in the world. In a confined space like the Strait of Hormuz, a determined defender with thousands of mines can create a killing field that no navy can safely navigate. The moment a nuclear weapon detonated over Iran, the order would be given. The mines would be laid, the missiles would be launched, the strait would close. The economic consequences of closing the strait would be immediate and catastrophic. The price of oil, already volatile due to the conflict, would skyrocket overnight. Gasoline prices in the United States would hit levels never seen before. Industries that depend on petroleum, which is to say almost every industry, would face skyrocketing costs. Supply chains would seize up. Factories would close. The global economy, already fragile from years of instability, would plunge into a recession that would make 2008 look like a minor downturn. And here is the cruel irony. The United States, which struck Iran to protect its interests and demonstrate its power, would find itself suffering an economic crisis of its own making. The pain would not be abstract. It would be felt at every gas station, every grocery store, and every household budget in America. The president who ordered the strike would face a political firestorm unlike any in American history, with voters demanding to know why they were paying $5, $6, $7 a gallon for gasoline while the country was being condemned by the entire world. And the conflict would not end with the closure of the strait. Iran's proxies across the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, would have survived the nuclear strike. Their leadership, their fighters, and their arsenals would remain intact. And they would have a new mission to make the United States and its allies pay for what happened in Iran. Hezbollah, with its vast rocket arsenal, would unleash a barrage on Israel that would dwarf anything seen in previous conflicts. The Houthis, who have already demonstrated the ability to strike shipping in the Red Sea, would intensify their attacks on American and Allied vessels. Hamas, whatever remained of its forces, would find new ways to strike at Israel. The result would not be an end to the war. It would be the beginning of a new, even more dangerous phase, one that could last for decades. American bases in the region would become targets. American diplomats would be at risk. American citizens would be urged to leave countries across the Middle East. The United States would find itself in a war without end, fighting not a single enemy, but a hydra of proxies, all of them motivated by a hunger for revenge that no amount of firepower could satisfy. Consequences for the world. While the immediate consequences for Iran and America would be devastating enough, the long-term consequences for the world would be even more profound. There is a document called the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, signed in 1968, which forms the foundation of the global nuclear order. Under this treaty, the nations that already had nuclear weapons, the United States, Russia, Britain, France, and China, agreed to work toward disarmament. In exchange, the non-nuclear nations agreed not to pursue their own bombs. This treaty has held, despite many challenges, for over half a century. It has not been perfect. India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel have all developed nuclear weapons outside the treaty framework. But the treaty has prevented the kind of cascade of proliferation that many feared in the 1960s. A nuclear strike on Iran would not just violate the spirit of the treaty, it would rip it to shreds. The message that every nation would take away from such an event would be brutally simple. Iran had a nuclear program. It was attacked. It did not yet have a bomb. and it was destroyed. Therefore, the only way to be safe from American intervention is to have a nuclear weapon before the Americans come for you. This is not speculation. It is the lesson that every country with ambitions or enemies would learn in an instant. And it is a lesson that would lead them to act. The first nation to act on this lesson would almost certainly be Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have long made it clear that they will not stand idly by while Iran develops nuclear weapons. In the past, they have stated publicly that if Iran gets the bomb, Saudi Arabia will get the bomb. But after a nuclear strike on Iran, the calculus would change dramatically. The Saudis would no longer be responding to an Iranian bomb. They would be responding to the fact that the United States, their ostensible ally, has just demonstrated a willingness to use nuclear weapons against a Muslim country. The Saudi leadership would look at the smoking craters where Iran's nuclear facilities once stood, and they would draw one conclusion. American protection is not enough. The only guarantee of survival is a nuclear arsenal of their own, developed as quickly as possible, perhaps with help from Pakistan, which already possesses nuclear weapons and shares close ties with the Saudi monarchy. Within months of a nuclear strike, Saudi scientists and engineers would be hard at work. Within a year, the world could have a new nuclear power in the heart of the Middle East. But Saudi Arabia would not be alone. Turkey, under its long-serving president, has already publicly questioned why Turkey should not have nuclear weapons. With Iran gone as a regional rival, Turkey would see a power vacuum and would want the ultimate tool to fill it. Turkey has the technical capability to build nuclear weapons, and it has the motivation. It is a NATO member that has grown increasingly distant from the United States, a nation with ambitions to be a regional hegemon, and a country that sits on the edge of a volatile region. Japan and South Korea, two nations that have relied on the American nuclear umbrella for decades, would face an impossible choice. They would watch the United States use nuclear weapons in Asia, or at least against a country in Asia. They would hear the rhetoric coming from North Korea and China. And they would ask themselves the same question that the Saudis were asking. Can we really trust that the American umbrella will always be there? Both Japan and South Korea have the technical capability to build nuclear weapons within months if they choose to. In a world where the nuclear taboo has been broken, the political constraints that have kept them non-nuclear would evaporate. The result would be a cascade, a chain reaction of proliferation that would see the number of nuclear-armed states double or triple within a decade. The carefully constructed global order that has prevented nuclear war for nearly 80 years would be gone. Would a nuke actually finish Iran? There is a question that lies at the heart of this entire hypothetical scenario, and it is a question that military planners have grappled with for generations. Can a nuclear weapon actually finish a country like Iran? To answer that, we have to distinguish between a state and a nation. A nuclear strike can destroy a state. It can vaporize its government buildings, incinerate its military command, and reduce its infrastructure to rubble. But a nation is something different. A nation is an idea, a culture, a shared identity that persists even when the institutions of government have collapsed. Iran is one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. Its people have survived conquests, invasions, and revolutions for over 2,500 years. They have a deep and powerful sense of national identity that is not dependent on any particular government or regime. A nuclear strike might destroy the Islamic Republic, but it would not destroy Iran. And the Iran that emerged from the rubble would be a country transformed by trauma, united by grief, and driven by an overwhelming desire for revenge. The regime that ordered the strike might believe that they have eliminated an enemy, but what they would have done is create a nation of 90 million people whose single unifying purpose would be to ensure that such a thing never happens again, and to make those responsible pay. There is a concept in Iranian strategic thinking that is essential to understanding how the regime itself views this conflict. It is the idea that survival is victory. For the leadership in Tehran, simply surviving the American onslaught, no matter how damaged, no matter how degraded, is seen as a win. They have watched what happened to other countries that challenged American power. They saw Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded and its leader executed. They saw Muammar Gaddafi's Libya destroyed after it gave up its nuclear program. They saw Ukraine invaded after it surrendered its nuclear arsenal, and they have drawn a very specific lesson from all of this. The only way to survive is to endure. If the regime can hold on, if it can maintain a functioning state no matter how battered, then it has proven its resilience and its legitimacy. A nuclear strike would ensure that the regime does not survive, but the people, the nation, the proxies, all of the elements that make up the Iranian sphere of influence would remain, and they would be united by a single, unshakable belief. The Americans tried to destroy us, and they failed. Now we will make them pay. This brings us back to the historical precedents that every Iranian leader, indeed every leader in the Middle East, has studied carefully. Libya under Gaddafi is a case study in the dangers of giving up nuclear ambitions. In 2003, Gaddafi agreed to dismantle his nuclear program and hand over his weapons of mass destruction to the United States. He did so believing that this would normalize relations and secure his regime. 8 years later, he was dragged from a drainage pipe and killed by rebels backed by NATO airstrikes. Ukraine is another example. In 1994, Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons it had inherited from the Soviet Union in exchange for security guarantees from the United States and Russia. 20 years later, Russia invaded Crimea, and the security guarantees turned out to be worthless. The message from both of these examples is clear. A nuclear weapon is the only guarantee of sovereignty. Iran, like every other threshold state, has watched these events and learned the lesson. A nuclear strike would only reinforce that lesson 1,000 times over. In the ashes of Iran, a new generation would grow up knowing that the only thing that could have saved their parents was a bomb of their own, and they would dedicate their lives to ensuring that no Iranian ever has to suffer that fate again. There is another dimension to this question that is often overlooked. A nuclear strike would not just destroy Iran's government, it would destroy the delicate balance of power in the Middle East. Iran, for all its flaws, has been a stabilizing force in some parts of the region, a counterweight to the ambitions of other powers. Its collapse would create a vacuum that would be filled by chaos. Ethnic and sectarian conflicts that have been held in check would erupt. The Kurds, who have long sought independence, would see an opportunity. The Sunni populations of Iraq and Syria would find themselves without a counterbalance to Shiite militias. The Gulf states, already nervous about Iran, would find themselves facing a new reality, a region without the one power that could keep everyone else in check. The result would not be peace. It would be a new, even more chaotic phase of conflict, one in which the United States would be drawn deeper and deeper, trying to manage a crisis of its own making. Would this start World War III? The final question, and the one that haunts every discussion of nuclear use, is whether such an act would trigger the conflict that the world has feared since 1945. Would a nuclear strike on Iran be the spark that ignites World War III? To understand the answer, we have to look at the web of alliances and interests that bind the great powers together. It is not as simple as Russia and China rushing to Iran's defense. Neither Moscow nor Beijing has a formal military alliance with Tehran, but they both have deep and complex interests in the region that would be directly threatened by an American nuclear strike. Russia sees Iran as a critical partner in its efforts to project power into the Middle East. Russian warships operate in the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf. Russian military advisors have been embedded with Iranian forces. And perhaps most importantly, Russia has its own nuclear arsenal and its own doctrines about the use of those weapons. If the United States demonstrates a willingness to use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear adversary, it fundamentally alters the strategic calculus for Moscow. They would have to ask themselves, if the Americans are willing to use nukes against Iran, what would they be willing to use against Russia? The answer would not be comforting, and it would lead to a massive increase in Russian nuclear readiness, a deployment of forces, a tightening of alliances, all of which would increase the risk of miscalculation. China's interests are even more directly tied to Iran's survival. China is the largest buyer of Iranian oil. The disruptions to global oil supplies that would follow a nuclear strike would hit China harder than almost any other country. Chinese refineries, Chinese factories, the entire Chinese economic machine depends on a steady flow of oil from the Persian Gulf. A nuclear strike that sends oil prices into the stratosphere and closes the Strait of Hormuz is an act of economic warfare against China, whether it is intended that way or not. And China, like Russia, has its own nuclear arsenal and its own red lines. The Chinese leadership would face a choice. They could accept the new reality, watch their economy suffer, and hope that the United States does not turn its attention to them next. Or they could respond, not necessarily with nuclear weapons, but with a massive military build-up, with a blockade of their own, with actions designed to demonstrate that they will not be pushed around. The risk of escalation would be immense. A crisis in the South China Sea, a confrontation over Taiwan, a clash between American and Chinese naval vessels. Any of these could quickly spiral out of control. There is a historical analogy that military historians have been drawing with increasing frequency, and it is a chilling one. The world before 1914 was a world of complex alliances, interlocking treaties, and great powers with conflicting interests. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a relatively minor event in the grand scheme of things, set off a chain reaction that within weeks had pulled every major European power into a war that killed millions. The argument that is being made today is that our current world is similarly fragile. A nuclear strike on Iran would be no minor event. It would be a black swan, an unpredictable shock that could shatter the existing order and set off a chain reaction of escalation that no one could control. The great powers would not want a world war, no one ever does, but history shows that wars often happen not because anyone wants them, but because events spiral beyond the ability of leaders to control them. A nuclear strike on Iran might not automatically start World War III, but it would be the closest we have ever come to finding out. And once the spiral begins, it is impossible to say where it would end. The weight of the unthinkable. So we return to the question that opened this exploration. What if President Trump nukes Iran? The answer, as we have seen, is not a simple one. It is a cascade of consequences that would unfold across multiple dimensions: human, political, economic, and strategic. The immediate objective might be achieved. Iran's nuclear program would be erased. The deep-buried uranium would be vaporized. The regime's command bunkers might be destroyed. But the cost of that achievement would be staggering beyond measure. Hundreds of thousands would die in the initial blast and the aftermath. Iran, an ancient civilization, would be scarred for generations. The United States would become a global pariah, isolated from its allies, condemned by the world, and facing an economic crisis of its own making as the Strait of Hormuz closes and oil prices explode. The nuclear taboo, the one line that no nation has crossed in 80 years, would be shattered. And in the vacuum that followed, nations around the world would draw the only lesson that the events would allow. The only way to be safe is to have the bomb. The result would be a cascade of proliferation that would see the number of nuclear-armed states double, tripling the chances of nuclear use in the future. And in the background, the great powers would watch, their own interests threatened, their own red lines approached, in a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous than anyone had imagined possible. This is not a scenario that ends with a mushroom cloud and a victory parade. It is a scenario that ends with a world transformed, a world with more nuclear weapons in more hands, a world where the restraints that have held for generations are gone, a world where the next crisis, and there would be a next crisis, would unfold in the shadow of the bomb. The advocates of a nuclear strike might argue that it offers decisiveness, that it ends the threat, that it saves American lives. But the evidence suggests otherwise. A nuclear strike would not end the conflict. It would transform it into something far more dangerous and far more enduring. It would not save American lives in the long run. It would subject American prosperity, American security, and American standing to risks that no nation should ever accept. And it would not prevent proliferation. It would cause it, unleashing a nuclear cascade that would leave the world more fragmented and more dangerous than it has been at any point since the dawn of the atomic age. The nuclear threshold has held for 80 years, not because nations have lacked the capability to cross it, but because leaders have understood, sometimes instinctively, sometimes through the hard lessons of history, that once you cross that line, you can never go back. The world after a nuclear strike would be a different world, one with fewer constraints, more weapons, and greater fear. And no one, not the president, not the Pentagon, not any leader on Earth, can predict where that new world would lead. So here is the question we leave with you. Do you believe that nuclear weapons are still off the table, a line that no American president would ever cross, no matter the provocation? Or do you think that in a world of increasing conflict and unpredictable leadership, the nuclear threshold is closer than we want to believe? Is there a scenario, a set of circumstances, a moment of crisis where the unthinkable suddenly becomes thinkable? These are not comfortable questions. They are not easy questions. But they are questions that we, as citizens of a nuclear-armed world, have a responsibility to ask. Because the decisions about nuclear weapons are not made by history or by fate. They are made by people, by leaders who face impossible choices in moments of crisis. And the only way to ensure that those choices are never made is to understand, deeply and thoroughly, what the consequences would be if they ever were. Thank you for watching. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think nuclear weapons are still off the table, or is this a red line that could one day be crossed? We will see you in the next video.